The real problem is that so many journalists are just far too frightened to be able to come forward in person and to speak openly at the inquiry about their experiences of life, the real life in the newsroom. They fear losing their job, they fear being made unemployable in the future, and if you're a casual or a freelancer, they fear their work drying up tomorrow as an automatic consequence of speaking out against the newspaper bosses in the industry.
And there were some pretty horrendous stories that you'd picked up once people had the confidence that they could give evidence anonymously.
Absolutely, completely horrific. And I deal with journalists on a day-to-day basis in some awful personal cases, but particularly speaking about some of the bullying, that's sadly endemic, far too endemic in some of our newsrooms. I found it personally upsetting and shocking to listen to just, what so many of our members have actually gone through on a day-to-day basis. It's terrible, and that's why it was really important to the union for us to be able to let journalists share and to get, for the public and for the inquiry to get an insight into those experiences. Even if they can't be there in person, it was really important to us that that testimony was allowed and that people could hear in their own words what it's been like for many, many journalists. Because at the moment, what we haven't had is a balance in this inquiry. We've had a succession of editors and bosses trooping up and telling us that pretty much everything's okay and that there doesn't really need to be significant change. And Leveson's looking at the culture, the ethics, the practices in newsrooms in the broadest possible sense. So it's really, really important that we hear what it's like for those journalists, the ordinary working journalists on the ground.
Because their work is in such contrast. I mean, this morning we had Edmondson from the formerly News of the World, this afternoon Paul Dacre. So the evidence from the shop floor, from the newsrooms, is very different from that.
Absolutely, and if it's not there being heard, that inquiry is getting a very distorted picture of what's going on in the industry. And what's been really clear, shocking but unsurprising, is that the newspaper giants have been desperately trying to pin the blame on individual journalists. They're happy to surrender up their journalists to see that the inquiry might make do with a few individual scalps as long as things don't change at the top, and we absolutely can't let that happen.
So what is the NUJ hoping for from the inquiry in the end of it?
Well, we want to give him the broadest possible picture of what's going on. We are demanding that journalists have a conscience clause so that when in a workplace they're faced with breaking their code of conduct, when they're asked to do something unethical that contravenes their code, they can stand up and say, no, I'm not doing that, I'm invoking my conscience clause. And it means that they have protection against being dismissed and against being bullied as a result of standing up on a principle of journalistic ethics. So that's a fundamental thing we need to gain from this inquiry going forward. And we also want a completely different model of press regulation for the future, one where journalists and the broader general public are at its heart, and it's not something that's dominated by newspaper editors in a cosy kind of boys club. That needs to change. We need radical reform. And finally, we also really need genuine collective bargaining in our workplaces. So many journalists simply don't have recourse to their independent trade union in the workplace. They have no one to turn to when they're being bullied, when they're being beasted by their editor, when they're being forced and pressured to deliver whatever the means, however unethical. They don't have anyone to turn to in the workplace, and many newspaper groups simply won't let the NUJ through the door, and that's got to change. Trade union, collective bargaining is a moral and it's a human right, and it's high time some of these newspaper groups were forced to let the NUJ back in.